Welcome back to Life Story 999. Today's story is about a young boy, Ethan, who bravely interrupted his father's wedding to reveal a dark truth. What started as a day filled with love and celebration quickly turned into a shocking event that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Ethan knew that something wasn't right with his father's fiancée, Emily, and despite his fears, he spoke up, unraveling secrets no one saw coming. Stay tuned as we dive deep into this heart-stopping tale. And before we continue, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and captivate. Sunlight streamed softly through the stained glass windows of the chapel, casting colorful patterns across the pews where family and friends waited excitedly. The warm glow filled the room with a quiet reverence, as whispers of anticipation flowed from one row to the next. Today was supposed to be one of the happiest days in David's life, but to his 8-year-old son, Ethan, something felt wrong. Ethan stood beside his father at the front of the chapel, his small hands gripping the pillow that held the wedding rings. He wore a miniature suit that matched his father's, complete with a neatly combed head of dark curls, but his gaze was fixed somewhere far beyond the chapel walls. Unlike the other guests, who smiled and whispered in excitement, Ethan's brown eyes were clouded with worry. His heart pounded as he looked up at his dad, who seemed unaware of his son's unease. For David, everything was perfect. He looked every bit the joyful groom, beaming as he waited to see Emily walk down the aisle. Ethan took a shaky breath, trying to calm the nervous energy bubbling within him. He knew he should feel happy for his dad, just like everyone else, but memories kept flashing through his mind, moments that left him with a sinking feeling about Emily. Though she was always warm and sweet when his dad was around, Ethan couldn't ignore the other side he'd seen, the way her expression changed when his father wasn't looking, the coldness that replaced her kind smile when they were alone. More than once, he'd caught her whispering into her phone, speaking urgently in a tone that chilled him, though he couldn't understand why. As the first notes of the wedding march filled the air, the congregation rose to their feet. The grand chapel doors began to open, and all eyes turned eagerly toward the entrance, waiting to see the bride. But Ethan's eyes didn't follow. Instead, he looked up at his dad, his grip on the pillow tightening as his small fingers dug into the fabric. He wanted to say something, anything, to warn his dad of the fear gnawing at him, but the words caught in his throat. "Are you okay, buddy?" David whispered, giving Ethan a reassuring smile. His father's gentle tone only added to the weight in Ethan's heart, and he forced himself to nod, unwilling to ruin his dad's big day. He knew how much his father loved Emily, how she'd brought a new spark of happiness to their lives. But that didn't make the sense of dread go away. The chapel doors swung fully open, and there she was, Emily, radiant in her white gown, her golden hair cascading down her shoulders. She looked like a fairy tale princess as she took her first step down the aisle, her face aglow with emotion. The guests sighed with delight, swept up in the romance of the moment. Yet as she moved forward, all Ethan could feel was the rising tension in his chest, a knot of worry that refused to ease. A few months earlier, David had introduced Ethan to Emily for the first time. It was a bright autumn afternoon, and the air was crisp and filled with the smell of falling leaves. David picked Ethan up from school that day with a big, excited smile, his eyes twinkling with a happiness that Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. "Ethan," he'd said as they drove home, "there's someone very special I want you to meet." His voice was warm, filled with an unmistakable joy, and for a moment, Ethan felt a mix of excitement and curiosity. After all, it had been just the two of them since his mother had passed, and the idea of someone new joining their little world was both thrilling and strange. When they pulled up to their house, there she was, standing on the porch with a friendly smile. Emily looked beautiful, her golden hair catching the soft light, and her bright eyes seemed warm and inviting. "Ethan, this is Emily," David said, his voice full of pride. "She's someone very important to me, and I hope you'll like her too." Emily knelt down to Ethan's level, her smile gentle as she said, "It's so nice to finally meet you, Ethan. Your dad talks about you all the time." She reached out a hand, and he hesitantly took it, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe this new chapter in their lives could be a happy one. In the beginning, things seemed promising. Emily would join them for dinners, laughing at David's jokes and even asking Ethan about school. She brought gifts, played board games with them, and seemed to genuinely enjoy their company. For a little while, Ethan let his guard down, thinking that maybe, just maybe, Emily could make their home feel whole again. But as the weeks passed, Ethan began to notice things that troubled him. Little things, at first. Moments when her smile would vanish if David left the room, or when her voice would take on a sharp edge if Ethan asked too many questions. When David wasn't around, Emily was different, cold, dismissive, and sometimes even mean. The warmth that she radiated when his father was present would disappear entirely, replaced by a stony expression that made Ethan feel small and unwelcome. One evening, Ethan had asked her a simple question about his homework. "Miss Emily, could you help me with this math problem?" he'd asked, hoping for a little guidance. Without even glancing up from her phone, she muttered, "Figure it out yourself, Ethan. I'm busy." Her tone was impatient, and Ethan felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He returned to his homework in silence, but the interaction left him with a feeling of unease that lingered long after. Over time, her dismissive attitude escalated. On several occasions, he caught her whispering into her phone when she thought no one was around. She would use a low, urgent tone, saying things that left him feeling unsettled, though he couldn't fully understand what she meant. Once, he overheard her talking to someone named Mark, and mentioning things like the plan and making sure it's foolproof. The words didn't make sense to him, but the secrecy made him uneasy. Why was she hiding things? And who was Mark? The turning point came on a Saturday night, when David had to work late. Emily was supposed to stay with Ethan, and the two of them sat down to dinner in the quiet house. Ethan tried to make small talk, hoping to bridge the gap between them. "Miss Emily," he began timidly, "do you like space? We're learning about the planets in school." Emily looked up from her phone with a bored expression, then sighed heavily. "Can't you just eat in silence for once, Ethan?" she snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. Ethan felt his heart sink as he returned to his food, the silence between them growing even colder. It was becoming clear to him that Emily's kindness was a mask she wore for his dad's sake, and when no one else was watching, she didn't feel the need to pretend. After that night, Ethan began noticing even more troubling things. He overheard more secretive phone calls, with phrases like insurance policy and as soon as we're married. He didn't fully understand the implications, but a growing sense of dread settled over him. Emily was up to something, and it involved his father. One afternoon, Ethan accidentally spilled a glass of juice in the living room while trying to balance it on a stack of books. As he scrambled to clean up the mess, Emily stormed into the room, her face twisted in anger. "You clumsy little brat," she hissed, grabbing his arm tightly. "Do you have any idea how much this carpet costs?" Ethan winced, feeling her fingers dig painfully into his arm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But instead of letting go, she leaned down and muttered, "If you tell your dad about this, you'll regret it." Ethan felt trapped. His father was growing more and more in love with Emily, blind to the side of her that only he seemed to see. David often talked about how lucky they were to have her, how she had brought happiness back into their lives. But for Ethan, each day felt like a test of his endurance, as he watched his father slip further into her grasp. In his heart, Ethan wanted to tell his father about everything, the cold stares, the sharp words, the strange phone calls. But each time he tried, he stopped himself, afraid that David wouldn't believe him. What if his dad thought he was just making things up because he missed his mom? Or worse, what if telling the truth only made things worse, leaving him alone with an even angrier Emily? As weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself in a world of silent suffering and confusion. He withdrew, spending more time in his room, avoiding family dinners and outings when he could. David noticed his son's quietness but chalked it up to shyness or perhaps even growing pains, never suspecting the turmoil Ethan was going through. The days grew colder as winter approached, and Ethan's sense of dread only deepened. His father was falling deeper in love with someone Ethan feared, and each passing day made him feel more helpless, more isolated. He knew Emily was hiding something, but the question that haunted him was, would he be able to make his father see the truth before it was too late? As the wedding day drew nearer, Ethan's sense of unease turned into outright dread. Emily's behavior was becoming more erratic, and the glimpses of her true nature, hidden behind that pleasant exterior, were now impossible to ignore. She had grown careless, and it was in one of these unguarded moments that Ethan uncovered a horrifying truth. It happened late one night, just a few days before the wedding. Ethan couldn't sleep, his mind restless with worry over what his father's life would become if Emily were part of it. He tiptoed down the stairs, hoping to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. As he neared the bottom step, he heard Emily's voice coming from the living room, tense and low. She was on the phone with someone, and Ethan instinctively crouched behind the banister, listening. "You're not listening to me, Mark," Emily snapped, her voice sharp. We can't rush this. Everything has to go according to plan. The insurance policy won't pay out if it doesn't look like an accident. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Insurance policy. Accident. He felt a chill run down his spine as he continued to listen, heart pounding in his chest. David doesn't suspect a thing, Emily continued, her voice softer now but laced with malice. Once the wedding is over, we'll move to phase 2. A tragic accident. I'll be a grieving widow, and then we're set for life. She laughed softly, a sound that made Ethan's skin crawl. Ethan was frozen, his young mind struggling to process the implications of what he was hearing. Emily wasn't just mean or cruel, she was dangerous. She was planning something terrible for his father. His mind raced, connecting the pieces of conversations he'd overheard in the past weeks. The references to Phase 2, the insistence on an accident, the life insurance policy. It all painted a dark, horrifying picture. He wanted to rush into the room and confront her, to scream and shout, to tell her to leave his father alone. But he knew that would only make things worse. Emily would surely deny everything, and who would believe the word of an 8-year-old against the polished, charming fiancée his father adored? Ethan crept back upstairs, his mind whirling with the weight of his discovery. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing as he tried to figure out what to do. How could he make his father see the truth? How could he save him? The next morning, Ethan was pale and silent at breakfast, his appetite completely gone. David noticed and ruffled his hair. "You feeling okay, buddy?" he asked, concern etched in his face. Ethan forced a nod, though inside, he was anything but okay. He wanted to tell his father everything, to shout out the terrible secret he'd uncovered. But he could already hear Emily's voice, her feigned shock, her soft tones as she accused him of misunderstanding, of making things up because he was nervous about the wedding. He could imagine his father's face, torn between his son and the woman he loved, and the thought made him feel sick with helplessness. Ethan's day passed in a blur. At school, he could barely focus on his lessons. His teacher asked him several times if he was feeling all right, but he just nodded and looked down, unable to explain the dread that had taken hold of him. His mind kept replaying Emily's words, the chilling clarity with which she'd spoken about hurting his father, as though it were nothing more than a business arrangement. That evening, Ethan found himself in his father's study, staring at the family photo on his dad's desk. It was a picture of the two of them from a trip to the lake last summer, both of them grinning ear to ear. The memory seemed to belong to another life, a life before Emily, before the fear and confusion that had become his daily reality. A single thought echoed in his mind. He couldn't let her hurt his dad. He had to do something. Summoning all his courage, Ethan knocked on his father's office door. "Come in," David called out, glancing up from his paperwork with a smile. "Hey, sport. What's up?" Ethan swallowed, feeling his heart hammering in his chest. "Dad, can I talk to you about something important?" he asked, his voice wavering. David set down his pen, looking at his son with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Of course, Ethan. You know you can tell me anything." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "It's about Emily. I don't think she likes me very much when you're not around. She says things, and she acts different. And last night, I overheard her saying some things that sounded really bad." David's brow furrowed as he listened, his expression becoming more serious. But before Ethan could continue, a shadow fell across the doorway. Emily was standing there, her face unreadable. "Oh, there you are," she said with a tight smile. "What's this about?" Ethan felt his stomach twist with fear, but David simply turned to her with a confused smile. "Ethan here was just saying he had some concerns. Apparently, he thinks you're not being very nice to him when I'm not around." Emily's eyes softened, and she walked over to Ethan, kneeling down to his level with a pitying look. "Oh, sweetheart, are you feeling nervous about the wedding?" she asked in a sickeningly sweet tone. "It's a big change for you, I know. But I promise, once we're all settled, you're going to see how much love I have for you and your dad." Ethan looked away, clenching his fists. He knew she was lying, but she had a way of making things sound so innocent, so believable. How could he convince his father of her true intentions when she could switch from threatening to gentle in an instant? David patted Ethan's shoulder, trying to reassure him. "You see, buddy, Emily cares about us. It's a big adjustment, but I think once we're a family, Things will be wonderful." Ethan felt a wave of despair wash over him. His father couldn't see through her act. He was blinded by love, and Ethan felt trapped in a cage of his own helplessness. The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. Ethan watched Emily's every move, searching for some new piece of evidence that might finally make his father believe him. But she was careful, always wearing her mask of sweetness when anyone was around, slipping into the shadows only when she thought no one was watching. Finally, just 2 days before the wedding, Ethan overheard another phone conversation. This time, he was hidden just outside her bedroom, holding his breath as she spoke. "Mark, stop worrying," Emily whispered sharply. "I've handled everything. The policy is in place, and once we're married, we just have to wait for the right moment. One tragic accident, and we're set. David will never know what hit him." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. It was real. All his fears were true. Emily was planning to hurt his father, to make it look like an accident so she could take everything. He stumbled back from the door, his mind reeling with panic. How could he stop this? That night, he lay awake, wrestling with his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the twisted look on Emily's face, hear her cold, calculating words. The clock ticked steadily, marking the hours that brought the wedding closer and closer. In the dim light of his bedroom, Ethan made a decision. He didn't know how he would do it, but he knew he couldn't let this wedding happen. He would find a way to reveal Emily's plans, even if it meant standing alone in front of everyone, even if no one believed him. He couldn't sleep that night, haunted by the knowledge that he was the only one who could protect his father. The chapel was filled with quiet anticipation as the wedding ceremony began. The guests watched with smiles, their eyes reflecting the warmth of the stained glass windows casting colored light over the scene. David stood at the altar, his eyes locked on Emily as she walked toward him, radiant in her white gown, her smile seemingly filled with love and excitement. Beside him, 8-year-old Ethan clutched the ring pillow tightly, his hands trembling. As the officiant opened the ceremony, reading the traditional words, Ethan felt a surge of panic rise within him. He knew it was now or never. He couldn't let his father fall victim to Emily's plans, no matter how terrified he was of standing up in front of everyone. Swallowing his fear, he took a deep breath, then stepped forward, his small voice cutting through the solemn silence. "Stop!" Ethan's voice echoed across the chapel, causing every head to turn toward him. A collective gasp filled the room, and a ripple of confusion and concern swept over the guests. David looked down at his son, stunned. "Ethan, what are you doing?" he asked, a mixture of worry and disbelief in his eyes. Ethan's heart pounded, but he held his ground, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze. "Dad, you can't marry her," he said, his voice steady despite the quivering in his hands. "She's lying to you. She's not who you think she is." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Emily's face tightened, a flicker of anger flashing in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a concerned expression. She knelt down beside Ethan, reaching for his shoulder with a practiced gentleness that made his skin crawl. "Ethan, honey," she cooed, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I know this is a big day, and it can be overwhelming. But don't worry, I'll be here for you and your dad. We'll be a family." Ethan pulled back from her touch, his resolve hardening. "No," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I heard you talking on the phone. You're planning to hurt Dad. You're only marrying him for his money." The silence in the chapel was deafening. David's face went pale as he looked from Ethan to Emily, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "Ethan," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, What are you saying?" Emily's face twisted in barely concealed fury, and for a brief moment her mask slipped. Her voice, once soft and comforting, turned cold and sharp. "Ethan," she said, her tone hardening, "you're being ridiculous. You're too young to understand. This is just a case of a boy afraid to let someone new into his life." But Ethan wouldn't be silenced. "No, I'm not lying," he insisted, his eyes welling up with tears. "I heard you. You were talking about an insurance policy, about how Dad wouldn't know what hit him after the wedding." David's face drained of color, and he took a step back from Emily, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. He turned to his fiancée, his voice low and filled with a growing sense of dread. "Emily, is any of this true?" Emily's expression faltered for just a second before she let out a nervous laugh. "David, you can't seriously believe this," she said, her voice laced with desperation. "He's just a child. He doesn't understand what he's saying. You know how kids can be, imagining things, getting confused. Ethan's just overwhelmed. David glanced down at his son, searching Ethan's face for any sign of doubt. But all he saw was his son's sincerity and the fear etched across his young features. He'd never seen Ethan look so determined, so certain. David's heart twisted painfully as he realized that his son would never say something like this unless he truly believed it. Taking a deep breath, David turned back to Emily, his voice steady. "I need you to tell me the truth, Emily. Right here, right now. What is going on?" Emily's expression hardened, her smile vanishing. She straightened, casting a venomous glare at Ethan. "This is absurd," she snapped, her voice turning harsh. "I've done nothing but love you, David, and I've tried to be there for Ethan, despite how difficult he's been. I don't have to stand here and be accused by a spoiled child who can't accept that his father has found happiness again." A collective gasp rippled through the guests as Emily's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Her anger bubbled over, and in that moment, her true self was laid bare. The soft-spoken, loving woman David thought he knew had disappeared, replaced by a bitter, cold-hearted stranger. David took another step back, his mind reeling. The woman standing before him was nothing like the person he thought he loved. He glanced at Ethan, who was standing resolute and unafraid, and suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. He thought about the moments when Ethan had seemed uneasy, the times he had tried to talk to him about Emily's behavior, and the times David had brushed it off, convinced his son was just adjusting to the idea of a new stepmother. Emily, seeing her grip on the situation slipping, turned back to David, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "David, please," she begged. "You can't possibly believe this. This is our wedding day. Think about everything we've planned, everything we've dreamed about together." But David's expression had shifted from confusion to a grim realization. He stared at her, his voice cold and measured. "Tell me the truth, Emily. Is there someone named Mark? Did you take out an insurance policy on me?" For a moment, Emily's face twisted in rage. She looked around at the guests, who were all watching with stunned expressions, and then back at David. She forced a smile, trying to regain control, but her eyes were dark with barely concealed fury. "Fine," she hissed under her breath, her voice just loud enough for David and Ethan to hear. "You want the truth? Yes, there is a plan. Yes, there is an insurance policy. And yes, I've been working with Mark." David staggered back, the betrayal washing over him like a wave. His hands shook as he tried to comprehend what he'd just heard, the reality of Emily's deceit crashing down on him. He had trusted her, allowed her into his life and into Ethan's life, believing she was the person who could make their family whole again. And now, here she was, admitting to a scheme that would have left him and his son in ruin. Ethan watched his father's face as he processed the truth, relief mixed with sadness in his heart. He was glad his father finally understood, but seeing the hurt and shock in his dad's eyes broke him a little. David looked down at Ethan, his face filled with regret and pain. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have listened to you." Ethan took his father's hand, squeezing it tightly. "It's okay, Dad. I just wanted to keep you safe." The silence was broken by a commotion near the back of the chapel. Several guests were standing, some whispering in shock, while others looked on with expressions of horror and disbelief. Emily glanced around, realizing that her charade had collapsed, that there was no going back. In a final, desperate move, she tried to regain control. "You're all fools," she spat, her voice dripping with venom as she addressed the guests. "You think you know me, but you don't know anything. I was doing what I had to do. I deserve more than a life of mediocrity, and if that means taking a few risks, so be it." Her words hung in the air, and David's face hardened as he looked at her, no longer the man who had once been blinded by love. "Emily," he said quietly, "I think you should leave." Emily sneered, casting a final withering glare at Ethan before she turned and walked down the aisle, her steps echoing through the shocked silence. She pushed through the doors of the chapel and disappeared, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos. The guests erupted into murmurs, and some rushed to David's side, offering words of comfort. David, still reeling, knelt down to embrace Ethan, holding him close as the weight of everything that had just happened settled over him. The officiant, looking pale and shaken, approached David. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Matthews. I can't believe. I had no idea." David shook his head, his voice filled with gratitude as he looked down at his son. "It's all right. I don't know what I would have done if Ethan hadn't spoken up." He hugged Ethan tightly, a wave of relief washing over him as he realized just how close he had come to disaster. He would never forget the courage it took for Ethan to speak the truth, even when he knew it could disrupt everything. It was a testament to the strength and love between them, a love that no one, not even someone like Emily, could destroy. As David stood with Ethan in his arms, surrounded by the support of friends and family, he knew that they would be okay. They had each other, and that was all they needed. And as for Emily, she was gone, her dark intentions exposed for everyone to see. In the quiet moments that followed, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The nightmare. After storming out of the chapel, Emily vanished, her plans and lies unraveling in front of everyone. However, her escape wasn't as smooth as she had hoped. Within hours, the police had tracked down her accomplice, Mark, who was hiding nearby, waiting for their next move. Mark was swiftly taken into custody, and under questioning, he revealed enough details about their scheme to confirm everything Ethan had bravely exposed. But Emily remained on the run, slipping through the authorities' grasp for the time being. Back at home, David felt the weight of betrayal settle heavily on him. He replayed every moment in his mind, all the signs he had ignored, all the times Ethan had tried to tell him something was wrong. The realization that he hadn't listened to his own son cut deeply, filling him with a painful mix of guilt and sorrow. He had wanted so desperately to believe in the new happiness he thought Emily brought into their lives that he had ignored the person who mattered most, Ethan. Once they were back in the quiet of their own home, David knelt down in front of his son, looking him directly in the eyes. "Ethan," he began, his voice filled with regret, "I am so sorry. I should have listened to you from the start. You were right, and I didn't believe you. I let myself get blinded by what I wanted and ignored the one person who really saw the truth." Ethan looked down, his small hands clasped tightly together. He was relieved it was all over, but he still felt the lingering hurt of those times when his dad hadn't believed him. After a moment, he looked back up at his father, seeing the genuine remorse in David's face. "It's okay, Dad," he whispered. "I just wanted you to be safe. I didn't want her to hurt you." David's eyes welled with tears as he reached out, pulling Ethan into a warm, tight hug. "I promise you, Ethan, from now on, I'll always listen to you. You're my son, and you'll always come first. No one will ever come between us again." He held Ethan close, letting the promise sink in for both of them. In the days that followed, David and Ethan worked together to rebuild the trust that had been tested so profoundly. David became more attentive, spending more quality time with Ethan, making sure his son knew that his voice was heard and valued. Every evening, they would talk openly about their day, sharing stories, fears, and dreams. These simple conversations became the foundation of a stronger bond between them, one that neither of them would ever take for granted again. As they began to heal from the ordeal, David noticed a change in Ethan, too. His son seemed more confident, more at ease. The courage Ethan had shown during those difficult days gave him a newfound resilience, and David felt a deep pride for the strength his son had shown. Gradually, David also found himself moving past the hurt and betrayal left by Emily. Her deception had left scars, but they were reminders of the lesson he'd learned about trust, family, and the importance of always being there for one another. He realized that, in the end, it was his son's love and bravery that had saved them both, bringing them closer than ever before. One evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie, David wrapped an arm around Ethan's shoulders, pulling him close. "You know," he said softly, "I don't know what I would have done without you, Ethan. You're my hero." Ethan looked up, a shy but proud smile spreading across his face. "I just did what I thought was right, Dad." David smiled, knowing that Ethan's courage had taught him a lesson he would carry with him forever. The ordeal had been painful, but through it, he had gained something invaluable, a deeper appreciation for the strength and wisdom that his young son possessed. From then on, David and Ethan faced each day with a renewed sense of togetherness and trust. The experience had shown them both that they could get through anything as long as they had each other. Emily's betrayal was a dark chapter in their lives, but it had also been the catalyst for a bond that would never be broken. A year after that fateful day, David and Ethan's lives have transformed in ways they couldn't have imagined. They have healed, leaving the past behind, and their bond is stronger than ever. To celebrate the closeness they share, they've started a new tradition. Each year, they take a special trip together, a time just for them to relax, reflect, and appreciate the bond they have. These outings have become a treasured part of their lives, filled with laughter, adventure, and meaningful conversations. Ethan's bravery on that day taught David invaluable lessons about love, honesty, and courage. He learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from listening to those we love, even when the truth is difficult to face. Watching his son grow and thrive has shown him the importance of standing up for what's right and staying true to oneself, even in the most challenging moments. David's heart is full of gratitude for the courage that saved them both, and he is determined to build a future grounded in trust, respect, and love. Together, they've not only survived but have built a life filled with resilience, joy, and an unbreakable bond. Thank you for tuning in to Life Story 999. If you were in Ethan's shoes, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories.